Right. Here's screen. Okay, so we looked at, we did a session on biochemistry, and we did a session on the digestive system. And so by combining the two of them together, I came up with this idea of just basic nutrition. And it's not called basic, it's just nutrition. But I hope to bring back some of the other things that I talked about before and give you some other insights into what's keeping us alive. So by definition, nutrition is, just reading it, the process of nourishing or being nourished, especially the process by which a living organism assimilates food. That means it becomes part of us and uses it for living, for growth, and the replacement of tissue. And by the way, the replacement of tissue happens the whole of our lives. It's a huge part of us. Now, the science of and the study of this is deals with food and with nourishment. And a source of nourishment, of course, is the food. So, well, I'll look at each of the ingredients separately with lots of examples. I hope it'd be enough to convince you of whatever I have to convince you of. So I'll look at the carbs, the fats, the proteins, vitamins, and the minerals, which are also called electrolytes, and water. And usually people forget about water when they talk about nutrition. Now, carbs are a group, and they're composed of different things. Now, sugars is one. Now, saccharides is I think it's from the Greek for sugar, and you'll see that word keeps coming up because it actually explains the shape of the molecule. Now, glycogen is a group of sugars in a particular way, which I'll get to later, and is stored in our livers and in our muscles, the striated muscles, the ones that move us around for future use. It's a store. Then we have starch, which is the equivalent in plants. It's made of the same molecules, but in a different configuration. Then we also have cellulose, which is similar to starch, but in a different configuration. And it's very, very, very tough. But we'll get to that. Now, the word carbohydrates, it comes from the three elements that make them up: carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen. And when you see ATE on the end of a chemical word, it means it's got oxygen. So carbohydrates, COH, when we write it out anyway, just in talking or in making notes, we just use COH for carbohydrates. So we've got carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen. Let's start off with sugar. Now, we all have sugar. We all must have sugar because that's where most of our energy comes from. And it's a class of chemicals, and that can be sweet or can be very unsweet. And it depends on the chemical configuration. I just found this lovely photo, and it might make your mouth drool a little bit, but all of those have got a lot of sugar in it. And the sugar in this case is cane sugar. And it's different from the others. So it's, as I said, very heavily used in the food industry. Most breakfasts, especially the ones fed to kids, has got far too much sugar in it. Now, in the we use glucose in Australia. In America, they use what's called fructose corn syrup. Now, they get their sugar from corn, but instead of glucose, which is what we use, they use fructose. And fructose is actually called fruit sugar. And it's much sweeter, but it has the same energy levels. So there are all sorts of natural sugars, cane sugar, fruit sugar, so that's glucose and fructose, honey, which the bees, of course, make. And if you have honey from different plants, you can taste the difference between the honeys. Agave is this great big spiky thing. It's a type of cactus, and people, I think it started in Mexico. They discovered that they can distill sugar out of the plant, and then the stevia. It's this plant here. It has produces the sugar that's different again, and it's used in making foods. Now, there are different names. I'll have to go into the biochemistry, give you the names, but they all make sense. Now, if you have a single sugar, a single glucose, a single fructose, whatever it is, you find the word saccharide in it, meaning sugar, and mono is single. Oops. So glucose it's cane sugar, dextrose. I put down here. It's identical to glucose, but made by corn. And grape sugar is, or grape sugar, the same thing. And fructose, it's a fruit sugar, is a bit different. And I'll show you in a minute how the difference is, and you probably won't even see it until it's pointed out. It's minimal looking, but it makes quite a difference. Now, when you get two saccharides together, two monosaccharides, you get a disaccharide. So a sucrose is one glucose and one fructose together. So cane sugar is sucrose, really. That's the sugar that we eat. You put in your tea, the white sugar or the brown sugar. But it's made up of two different sugars. Okay, now, the biochemistry of it is that if you look at this molecule here on the left, you notice that it's got hang on, have we got the right one? No, it'll come up later. Sorry. Okay, these two are the same. So these are two glucose molecules, and to link them, these two OH, oxygen, hydrogen parts of it, join together, and they're linked together with this oxygen, and what's left over is water. So you actually produce water when you move from two monosaccharides to a disaccharide. And this link here between these two molecules is called glycosidic linkage. So the glide bit refers to sugar. So we get a condensation reaction. This is the same diagram that I just had. And the condensation reactions means that you're producing water. Now, here's another one. Two amino acids, which has got nothing to do with sugar, but because I've decided to tell you what it's called, I'll give you other examples. When two different amino acids, and I won't explain what you're seeing, except that they're linked together. So when they're linked together, you get a water molecule. And this is, so you get it's called a dipeptide, because when you join two amino acids, you get a peptide bond. But that'll come later. When you've got fats, so fats are made up of a glycerol, these three carbons, and you get a number of fatty acids, and the fatty acids is what it makes different fats, because you can have three the same, two and one, all different, but they all link together and they all produce water to give you what's called the triglyceride. And you get different sorts of triglyceride. I'll get to that later. This is just, if I'm mentioning condensation reaction, you know what I talked about.
Ruben, can I ask you, what does the R stand for in the first?
Okay. Yes. Yeah. All right. In amino acids, there are hundreds of amino acids, and they all have the same structure up to the OH here. And remember we talked about biochemistry. Carbon has to have can have 4 bonds. It does have 4 bonds. You can have 4 things attached. Now in amino acids, the R is the addition to it, an amino acid. So R1, 2. Someone came up with it. I don't even remember what the R stands for.
Thanks. Just wondered what chemical it is. Okay.
It's amino acids. Yes. Yes. So okay. So when we eat sugar, you have a piece of cake, you have anything with sucrose, which is cane sugar. It's broken down to glucose and fructose, and which then we can absorb into the bloodstream. We can't absorb sucrose. So when we have a dairy anything, milk in your tea or coffee or milkshake or cheese, anything with milk, it is the product also have a disaccharide sugar called lactose, which is milk sugar. Okay, so when people talk about sugar, usually all they think about is what's in your little jar, the little with the white granules. It's much more complex than that. So lactose is made up of 2 monosaccharides. Okay? Glucose with met. A third one here is galactose. So all these single ones, galactose, glucose, fructose, are called simple sugars. It's single ones. Now, glucose and galactose are transported from the intestines straight to the liver. And that is absolutely essential that they don't go anywhere else except the liver. I'll explain in a moment. But before I do, just have a look at the structure. Now, you've seen this before. This is the glucose. And where the OH groups are, there, they vary. And also with fructose, it's pentagonal, whereas glucose and galactose are hexagonal. So the slight differences and makes all the difference. So if you look at galactose, you'll see where the OH bonds are relative to this oxygen, makes all the difference. So glycogen is the animal equivalent of starch. We store our sugar, our glucose, and fructose and galactose can get converted to glucose in our bodies because we eat them. The glucose is stored in our liver, and it's stored in our muscles, our striated muscles, the ones that move us. You may remember that we have 2 types of muscles, striated and smooth. The smooth ones that can keep contracting for exceptionally long times, whereas the striated ones can't. So you can't hold a kilo weight in your hand for very long, or do anything for very long. It just relaxes all the striated muscles prefer relaxation, like some people. Now, so our main source of energy is glucose. And we have this massive store, it's absolutely massive, in the liver. Fructose is converted in the body to fat. So if you have a lot of sugar in the form of fructose, it adds a little bit to the fat. When we eat starch, when we eat starch, it gets broken down to glucose, right? Because it's made of glucose. Starch is 100% glucose. The glucose mustn't, this is what I was leading up to the bit about going straight to the liver. The glucose must not enter our circulation, because if it gets to the brain, you've had it. The brain cannot handle the amount of sugar that moves from the intestines to the liver. It can't do it. You'll just collapse. And so it's got to be stored, as I said, in the liver and then muscle. So for this to happen, the pancreas, which is stimulated from the small intestine to say, hey, glucose or sugars are coming, it starts producing insulin that goes directly to the liver through the bloodstream and to the muscle cells. And, and so that the insulin allows, it's really like a gate. It acts actually as a little tube, if you like that, and it works on a click-clack method. It opens up, a glucose comes in on the outside of the cell, then it closes and it pops into the cell. And that's what the molecule does all day when it's busy. So the pancreas produces the insulin goes to the liver, goes to the skeletal muscles. They're the ones that move us around. And then once in the muscle, once in the liver, it converts the glucose is put together and produces glycogen. And that's safe. So therefore, we can say we have polysaccharides. Now, the polysaccharides, like the glycogen, is a very, very, very large continuous molecule. It's massive. We're talking millions, billions of molecules. Starch is the same. It's made of glucose and cellulose, as mentioned before. It's the same. Same molecule, very large numbers, but different structure. So let's have a look. Glycogen, and this is where the liver stores glucose in animals. And when it's broken down when energy is required. So the question is, how do you get the glycogen, which is this massive store, to break down enough glucose molecules, just break them off and get them to go into the bloodstream and do what they have to do. Now, I'm talking, I'm thinking, I'm moving my hands around. I can't do any of that without glucose. Impossible. But that's the direct energy source. So we have a second pancreatic hormone called glucagon. And when we need glucose, the system sends a message to the pancreas, producing glucagon, and the glucagon finds its way to the liver. And then by the concentration of glucagon, how much is produced, that much glucose is released, and then we can do what we can. In starch, it's exactly the same, except they don't have a liver, but it's stored inside individual cells. And then when animals eat the starch, The starch is broken down to glucose, and then it's stored as glycogen. So it's the same molecule stored in a different structure. Cellulose, on the other hand, is quite different. And even though it's the same molecule again, glucose, it's quite different. And it makes a very, very tough cell walls of plant cells. Okay, so it's not, but they're in sheets. So this is what they look like. Starch in plants is really just long strands of glucose. And in animals, the glycogen is more complex. It's what do you call it? It's got branches. It's branched. And cellulose is sheets. You can see the sheets like that. It's a bit like the starch, but then all these starch molecules are joined together in sheets. And that's around every animal, every plant cell. And it's very tough. Now, fiber it can vary. This is fiber in I got a Arthur, did you say something or?
I'd like to ask you, Ruben, if one is a diabetic, does the pancreas not supply enough insulin to break down the sugars, or what happens?
Sorry, I was just reading something that came in. Can you say that again?
If somebody is a diabetic, does the pancreas not supply enough insulin to break down the sugars, or what happens?
In diabetes?
Yeah.
Yes, the insulin is not produced. So to get our insulin production is intermittent. It's produced as required. So if you're not producing enough, then you don't have the energy, you can't do whatever you're doing, whatever you want to do. And that's why type 1 diabetics have to have injections. The modern insulin injections they have are quite different. The length of work of activity is different, but they have to self-inject, or they have now these pumps that they wear around themselves and inject. Type 2 diabetes is sort of similar but quite different, and that can be controlled. But type 1 is more genetic.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Okay. When you know that when we talk about diet, we say you've got to have fiber with your diet so that you're regular, you have a decent crap every day. It's very, very important. And we have two types of fibers. The one's called soluble fiber, and it's very useful in reducing the absorption of fats into our system in the gut. So, for example, cholesterol. We don't want cholesterol. Some people who have a little bit too much cholesterol then find that they're starting to produce plaque blocking arteries. It could be in the heart, could be in the brain, or to the brain. The brain itself, I don't know if you know, does not have a blood circulation. It's the outside of the brain, and it's got another liquid inside that moves the oxygen around, the carbon dioxide and so on. Anyway, so soluble is very, very useful, very important, in fact, in our diet. So if you have bran, for example, that has some soluble and some insoluble. I'll get I'll explain the other one in a minute. Okay, it also attracts water. So if you have soluble fiber, like bran, for example, for breakfast, it'll absorb water. It forms a sort of a gel, and it slows down the digestion, so you don't feel so hungry so soon after eating it. And also because it's like gel-like, it slows the stomach emptying itself, so you still feel full. So you're not nothing, you're not eating too much through the day. Well, at least in the morning to lunch. But it helps weight control. If you're not hungry, you just don't eat very much. So, and the sources of soluble fiber, well, if you look at these, I won't read them all, you've got them, but oatmeal, etc., the lentils, apples, most of these are fruits, nuts. They're very important for our gut health, very important. And people who don't eat things like lentils and pulses or fruits may have issues with their digestive system. Insoluble fiber is different, and because it acts as a laxative, and it goes through you and it pushes the material through. Because the gut, the small intestine, has to push on something, to squeeze on something and to keep moving it. And by the way, all these tubes that we have in us, which move things through, they've got two sets of muscles: circular muscles, which squeeze, and longitudinal muscles, which push. And so you need something to push on or to squeeze on for things to actually happen. So that's why insoluble fiber is just so important in our diet. They don't dissolve in water, and they just pass through. And things like whole wheat, whole grains, whole bran, if you read it, cabbage, zucchini, celery, cucumber, and some fruits. And if you're cooking and you throw some of these in into every dinner, and things will be good. So, and there's another one, another area that glucose is very important, and is chitin. Now, chitin is the cell walls of fungi. So if you eat mushroom, you're eating glucose, but in a different form again, and that's called chitin. Arthropods, things like crayfish, lobsters, crabs, also insects, some, the material that they're made of, the exoskeleton, is glucose, pure glucose, but in a different configuration. Now, mollusks like snails and shellfish, where they go around and they scrape food like algae off rocks or whatever, they have these special mouth parts called radula, or radulae is plural, and they just do that. And they're also made of chitin, which is glucose. Cephalopods, and octopus, squid, they also have beaks, very sharp beaks, and that's made of chitin, glucose. So there's your glucose molecule, the brown part, and to each glucose molecule, there's an amino acid, and an N, a nitrogen acetyl group. It's just this general amino acid, and that together produces this very tough material. So here's another example of sugar, glucose, put together in a particular way to produce cellulose. Here we have chitin, and then look at it, it's almost identical, except it's got these amino acids down the bottom here. So nature didn't have to reinvent things all the time. It just took what it had, and because cellulose came a long, long time before animals did, plants from billions of years before animals really took over.
Should we try to eat chitin?
I wouldn't. I don't think you can digest it. I don't think anything will happen. It'll just go through you. But all right. Now, here's something to stimulate the brain a bit. I think called the glycemic index. Now, if you see a word like glycemic, the GLY refers to sugar. The AEM refers to blood. So we're talking blood sugar, the amount of sugar, and this is glucose, in the blood at any time. So the glycemic index of a food, whatever you eat, it relates to how quickly, there's a definition, how quickly starch is broken down to glucose and absorbed into the blood. Okay, and this is the numbers are important. So the glycemic index of a food is compared to the glycemic index of pure glucose. So they have to have a base level from which to work this out. So to get pure glucose, because that's everywhere, and with whatever's added to it will increase the glycemic index. So the lower the GI, the lower the glycemic index, the less effect the food has on insulin. Therefore, it's healthier. But if you have, say an apple, some insulin will be produced. You have a slice of cake, a lot of insulin is produced. And if you have a lot of insulin produced a lot of the time, that causes issues. So here's a graph. So the x-axis refers to time, the minutes after intake. The y-axis, blood glucose in millimoles per liter. All right, don't worry about the unit. So if you have a high GI, that's straight glucose, this red one here, within 50 minutes, you've got this great big hump and then it comes down. Whereas with beans, whatever beans, I don't know which beans they use to test with, it takes a lot longer and a much more gentle rise in the production of insulin. Okay, so the glycemic index is low. So the lower the glycemic index, the better for the health. So I've given some examples here. We'll start with a low GI. The number is 55 or less. A number is given. I'll show you in a sec. So fruits, vegetables, beans, grains, eggs, milk, nuts, even meat. Medium, 56 or 69. Macaroni and cheese, mac and cheese. We have kids love that, but it's not that good because of the macaroni. Table sugar, what's it? Sweet potato, bananas, raisins, grapefruit juice. And then the high GI, which is over 70, baked potatoes, white bread, rice, pasta, it's all white stuff, cornflakes, donuts. Now, that's the glycemic index. So we have a thing called a glycemic load, which is how much of the food will raise a person's blood glucose level after eating it. Okay? How high will the glycemic level, the glucose level go up? So 1 unit of glycemic load approximates the consuming of 1 gram of sugar, of glucose. Okay? 1 gram of glucose is 1 gram of glycemic load. So here's an example. the glycemic index of a standard apple. I don't know what a standard apple is. I don't know how sweet it is, but let's just take a standard apple. Maybe I don't know, a sweet one or not so sweet one. So the carbohydrate content of a standard apple is 15 grams. So the load, the glycemic load, is the glycemic index times the carbohydrate content divided by 100. So you take 40 by 15 and divided by 100 is 6. So an apple has a glycemic load of 6, which is good. So have a look here. The low glycemic loads, oat bran, V8 juice, it's made of 8 different juices, carrots, apples, they're low. The glycemic, you've got these others here. The high one, pancakes, white rice, bagels, they're high. The glycemic index of white potatoes, white bread, notice the white stuff. There's virtually no fiber there. Very high. And the glycemic, the low glycemic index, oat bran, lentils, apples, strawberries. And these affect the amount of glucose that's in the body. And that affects how the brain reacts. So to have a low glycemic load with a low glycemic index, this is an important table, all these things here. Whereas if you go to the other end, a high glycemic load and high glycemic index things, baked potatoes, cornflakes. So if people eat, kids have a bowl of cornflakes in the morning to go to school with milk and sugar, they're flying high on glucose. But the problem there, it's very quickly absorbed into the liver, and then the kids are hungry or cleverly eating it. So you've got this table. I suggest you look at it carefully. And there's another. I think I've given you this one too. It's a very important piece of information to know how to work your way through this sort of information so that you can eat and drink the right sort of foods. So red wine, beer, the glycemic index is low, orange juice is high. Gatorade, I'm not exactly sure what's in that, is very high. Sugar. So Fanta, orange Fanta, cranberry, very high. The grains, the starches. Anyway, I haven't got the time to go through each of it, but you have a look. Yeah. Now the sugars in processed food, all these have sugar in them. I like this. Don't slice my pizza. My diet says I'm only allowed to eat one piece. It's a nice piece of logic. Let's look at fats. Now, we usually call them fats, but they are just what's a subset of lipids. Lipids are liquid fats and solid fats. But usually people refer to them as liquid. So at room temperature, fats are usually solid and oils are liquids. So here's a definition. Fats are solid. So butter is solid, oil is a liquid. And like carbs, they're made of carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen, the same as carbohydrates. And the fats that come from glycerol and fatty acids. Now, I mentioned the fatty acids before, but let's have a look. So this is a fat. The glycerol is the same. That's the backbone of fat. Okay, so, and I won't go through the chemistry, but then attached to that are chains. And each glycerol, this bit here, has 3 fatty acids attached, which I just said. And these are called triglycerides. You've heard of triglycerides, you know that they're not too good for your heart health. Some of them. Now, the fats are a store of energy. Now, you've heard talk about glycogen. And glycogen is a store of immediate energy in the liver and the muscle. Now, I've been sitting here for nearly an hour and with my legs. If I want to get up and go for a walk, go to the toilet or something, my muscles must immediately release the glucose to produce ATP so I can move. It's immediate. On the other hand, fats are a much slower store to release this energy. The different sort of store. Now, plants and animals can convert fats to sugars to produce energy. Okay, that's good. And the energy itself is not the fat, it's not the glucose. It's this thing called ATP. Now, adenosine is a form of one of the amino acids, adenine, and it's got 3 triphosphate, got 3 phosphates. Now, ATP is the gold standard of energy. Animals store fat as white fat. Now, around our bellies, around our bottoms, everywhere, we have white fat, and it's also called white adipose tissue. Adipose tissue is fat tissue, because fat itself is a tissue, because the fat is stored in cells, special fat cells. Now, I'm not talking about fat as in large, the fat is stored in them. So, but you don't normally hear of the WAT, it's usually white fat. Newborn babies, they pop out of the uterus, they have as well as having some white fat, they also have a store of brown fat. And like the white adipose tissue, it's called brown adipose tissue or BAT, between their shoulder blades. So a baby just born and can survive for 2-3 days, sometimes more, without having been fed, having to be fed. And it's a very high energy fat, and it can keep the baby warm, alive for a few days. And then it's used up. And this is between their shoulder blades. And the reason that it has, now, this is the first one I'm mentioning, mitochondria. These are originally, in the history of evolution, when cells in water started developing, there were also bacteria before the cells. These are cells with nucleus. Bacteria don't have a nucleus. But the current thinking is that mitochondria were a type of bacteria, if you like, which got absorbed by a simple cell of that time. We're talking billions of years ago. And they got on really well. It was a symbiotic relationship. The cell gave the mitochondria protection. The mitochondria was able to produce energy. So it allowed the cell to do things it couldn't do before. So it was an energy production. And because it was a living organism before it got absorbed, it's got its own DNA, it's got its own chromosomes. And so mitochondrial DNA is what they use in genealogy. And mitochondria are always passed on from generation to generation only through the mother. At another time, I'll explain why, but it's only through the mother. So all genealogy is done through the mother's line. And also, different parts of the world, people had had modifications to their mitochondria, or their DNA. So by looking at mitochondrial DNA, you can tell what part of the world that person was originally from, or the family line. But that's another story. Recently, it was discovered that, going back to brown fat, that adults, us, we have some brown fat in our bodies, and usually around the major arteries, up the top of the chest, around the aorta, and around the vena cava, that takes the vein, brings blood back into the heart. And when we become hypothermic, we just have lost so much heat, we're shaking like crazy, just shivering. The brown fat starts to break down, and it produces enough heat to warm. It's a small amount of brown fat, it'll warm the body up a bit to stop you from dying. And this is a recent discovery. With fats, we hear about unsaturated, monounsaturated, polyunsaturated fatty acids, and also saturated. So this is the chemistry part. We also have trans fats, which are really nasty things. A fatty acid here, this hydrogen usually makes it, that's what it's called, an acid. Okay, so you've got here when I've done the biochemistry, we talk about carbon atoms. Every carbon has to have 4 bonds. So if you look at any of these carbons, you've got 1, 2, 3, 4. So 4 bonds. It has to have 4, otherwise it just won't work. So it's saturated with all these single bonds along here. It has the maximum number of hydrogen atoms that can link to it. And that's called saturated fatty acid. Now, some of the fatty acids have double bonds. So you have 2 fewer, 2 as in TWO, hydrogen atoms, right? They're missing from there. There's nothing wrong with it, but that's just the way it is. So it's not saturated. It has fewer hydrogens here than in this one. So we have unsaturated fatty acids. So here are what's called a monounsaturated fatty acid, the oleic acid. And there's another one called linoleic acid. It's polyunsaturated fatty acid. So this has got 1 double bond. This one's got 2 double bonds, and it varies. But it's the saturated fatty acids which cause heart issues, because cholesterol is a saturated acid, fatty acid. Whereas the unsaturated fatty acids are the ones that actually are really, really useful and healthy. And hopefully this gives you an idea of, when we talk about saturated, unsaturated, the chemistry gives you that little bit extra understanding. So unsaturated fats and oils are considered healthy because they tend to actually lower the bad cholesterol, which is the low density liver proteins, and they raise the high density liver proteins. Now, A lipoprotein is a fat attached to a protein, and they move around the body during their function. Now, saturated fats, these are unsaturated, have the opposite effect, and they're very unhealthy. The trans fats, as opposed to cis fats. I'll explain in a minute what the difference is. Now, trans fats are unsaturated fats which have a slight change in the structure, and they have a strong effect on raising the low density lipoproteins. And that has caused a problem in America. Trans fats have been used when they produced margarine, and they found that the amount of heart disease increased when that happened, and they found that the trans fats are not really very good, and so they are produced during the process. The trans and the cis, I just put this in to show you, refers to the positioning of relative, in this case, hydrogens. So if they're opposite each other, they're trans. If they're next to each other, they're cis. Now, I'm sure you've been hearing about trans children, trans young adults. It's from here. Cis means the same. So cis means at the same level. So a boy and a boy, a girl and a girl, as in relationships, they're cis. But if you're a girl and you stay a girl, you're called cis. If you're a girl and you want to become a boy, they call you trans. You change over. That's a chemical word, and they picked it up. So we have two essential fatty acids that must be eaten to maintain a healthy diet. Two. These are I showed you before, the alpha linolenic and the linoleic acid, the omega-3 and the omega-6 fatty acids. And some of the foods have that, like fish oil, shellfish, soy oil, canola, pumpkin, and that's where they're found, rather than animal-based fats. And fats that include saturated fat are essential to our diets, but you can't have too much of them, because all our cells have membranes which are made of fat. So the membranes are fat. Some of the hormones are produced from cholesterol, which we must have. We can't live without cholesterol. It's just having too much of it that's a problem. So there are fat-based hormones, the sex hormones, the estrogen, progesterone, testosterone, and also cortisol, which is produced when there's an inflammation. Now you have also subcutaneous fat, and that is fat that is under the skin, subcutaneous, and it gives us our shape. So we are recognized by our shape, and we are recognized by where the various layers of fat under the skin are. So some people have more puffier cheeks, for example, others less. And that's the genetics of that particular person. We also have essential fatty acids, and they are very important in lots of our metabolic processes. And the wrong, so low levels of these essential fatty acids, or the wrong balance, can cause issues, especially things like osteoporosis, where the bone tissue is starting to fall apart because some of the molecules are broken down and it becomes porous and then very, very brittle. The trans fats, I mentioned this before, they raise they increase the what's called the low density lipoproteins. They're the bad ones if we have too much of it, and they lower the good ones. So the bad ones increase, the good ones decrease, and then we've got issues. And in America they had to change the way they produce certain processed foods to decrease the amount of trans fat or get rid of it altogether. We don't seem to have the problem in Australia. Eating trans increases the risk of developing heart disease and stroke. And they're also associated with a greater risk of type 2 diabetes developing. I'll put this photo in. Now your mouth might start to salivate. And these are the foods with very high levels of low density lipoprotein, the bad fats. You've got to have some, but not that much.
And I just heard on the news today that they are trying to cut out the chips, frying of the chips, particularly in the sports establishment. They suggest to use air fryers now.
Yes.
Yeah.
But I don't know. Don't you have to spray the food with oil before you put it into the air fryer?
They didn't mention it, but even that, it won't be as much oil as when you fry it.
Yes, that's true. That's true.
Yeah.
But it also depends what you use to spray the oil, which oil you use. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
That's a good move.
A good move. Yeah.
I like this cartoon. Not only can we build it for the same price as any other gingerbread house, but we can give you 40% less carbs and no trans fats. This is an American joke. And the doctor told me to introduce more greens into my diet. He says eating mint ice cream. Okay, that was fats. Let's look at protein.
Ruben, are we saying that butter is more healthier than margarine?
In Australia, they do it differently, so we don't have the problem with the trans fats in margarine like they do in America. Butter has got low density lipoproteins. The butter is worse, especially if you've got heart issues. Does that make sense?
Okay.
Okay. Now we have 7
Thanks.
types of proteins in our bodies. These are generalizations. We have contractile proteins. They contract. We have 3 different types of muscles in our bodies. So we have the smooth muscles, the striated muscles, the smooth muscles that never give up. They always stay closed and released. They open up as required. The straight ones are the ones that we move with, and then there's a cardiac muscle. The reactive molecules, the proteins, are all the enzymes. You've got a huge number of them. We have communicative molecules, which are the hormones. Most come from the brain, some from the thyroid, the parathyroid. We've got the pancreas. The pancreas produces 2. The structural ones, proteins, the keratin, like our hair, our fingernails, our skin is covered a layer of keratin. It's tough stuff. Tendons, ligaments, they're all proteins. We have transport proteins, hemoglobin. They move oxygen around the blood. And myoglobin, they move oxygen around muscles. We have defensive molecules, and they're the antibodies that are produced as required. We have storage proteins, but not us, eggs. So the ovalbumin is the white of an egg. It's 100%, almost 100% protein. So that's, so of those 7, we have 6 of them. Now, as you saw before, carbohydrates and fats are produced of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Proteins also have nitrogen, and some of them, not all, of the amino acids have a bit of sulfur. So the basic unit is the amino acid, and the amino word bit comes from the amine. It's got nitrogen. That nitrogen is referred in there. So this is the basic structure of an amino acid. So again, remember, carbon got to have 4 bonds. On one side, you've got the NH2, nitrogen with 2 hydrogens, and that's called the amino group. On the other side, you've got a carboxyl group, COOH, and that's a carboxyl group. And that's all amino acid. All amino acids have that. There's the R group, which is the side chain, and it varies. It could have just a single hydrogen, or it could have a nitrate, it could have anything. When we, animals, produce, and plants, I'm pretty sure, when we produce any protein, we use 20 different amino acids in the various sequences, because the sequence of amino acids gives you the shape of the protein. So some proteins are positive, some are negative, and some are neutral charged. I think anything else I'll bring up later. Okay, so the yeah, I don't need that. So here's an example. Here's an amino acid. So the NH2, there's a hydrogen there, COOH here, and there's another one here. It doesn't matter what the R group is. And then to join them together, you get, as before, you get water. So here, this carbon here is this one. So by removing this hydrogen and oxygen, this is only in the diagram, but pretty close, and this hydrogen, oxygen, and 2 hydrogens make water. Okay, so we have the same sort of reaction as before, and you form a bond. And this bond is called a peptide bond. It's the bond between any 2 amino acids. Okay, just to show you. All of these are high in proteins as compared to the other photo of the other food, which I won't go into. So our bodies, we can produce about 100,000 different proteins. We've got the capacity, and that capacity is built into our genes. Now we have about 32,000 genes. So another time, I'm trying to explain how you can get 100,000 out of 32, but that's another story. I look forward to that. We also have about 100 different amino acids in our systems, but we only use 20 of them to produce proteins, and the size and shape of every protein is coded in the genes. Now, we have 2 basic protein structures. We have a basic amino acid sequence. Okay, that's called the primary structure. When it comes off, where the information comes off the DNA, this is what happens. You end up with this structure, a long sequence. Then the long sequence starts folding in a particular way. And there are two types of folds. There's what's called a sheet, a pleated sheet. So you have the sequences here and here, but they've got cross linkages. And there's also the other form is the alpha helix, like that. And then to produce any protein, they have various combinations of these two. So straight off the DNA, you get the primary structure. Once they start folding, you get the secondary structure. And then by putting together the bits and pieces, you get the tertiary structure. The quaternary structure is when you get multiples of these tertiary ones together. So for example, hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is actually made up of 4 molecules and 2 sorts, 2 and 2. But again, that's a slightly different story, but this is how proteins are formed. They're very complex. And by the way, how you get all these folds is dependent on the sequence of the amino acids. Because some amino acids have a charge, a positive or negative, and some have no charge. So if you have a whole series of, I don't know, say negative charges, they will repel each other. If you have some positive and some negative, they'll attract each other. And then the ones which are neutral, they're sort of spaces. And if you think that the information in our DNA can produce this and us and every living thing over the billions of years that have been, the evolution of this sort of situation, this sort of structure, this process, if that doesn't blow people's minds, I don't know what will. It's so complex and it's happening all the time in our bodies without any fault. We don't even know it's happening. And look at it. And this is a very simplified version of it. So there are also variations of proteins when we add other molecules. So when we add a sugar, whatever the sugar is, there are lots of sugars, to a protein, it's called a glycoprotein. And glycoproteins are very, very important in our immune system. Okay, so we're different molecules. When you have a fat and a protein, they're called lipo or lipo, depends on which university you went to. So lipoproteins, right? And we have 2 forms of them, HDLs and LDLs, the high density lipoproteins and the low density. The the HDLs are healthy. The LDLs are not. Yeah. So depends also on the food that you eat. So this is what we produce. So of the 20 amino acids that we use to produce protein, there are many more many amino acids, but we only use 20 to produce our proteins. And 9 of them are essential amino acids, which means 11 of them are not. So 11 of them we can make. 9 of them we can't actually produce, which means we have to eat them. So you have to have a balanced diet in a way so the amino acids are all there. So one must ensure that the 9 essentials are part of the diet. So the 9 essential amino acids are, and I've listed them, you may or may not have heard of them, phenylalanine, valine, tryptophan, methionine, leucine, isoleucine, lysine, threonine, histidine. And they are essential. Even if one is missing, we have a problem. Now, vegetarians have this problem because we get all of these essential amino acids from the meat that we eat or other forms of protein, but meat's got the highest level of protein. So if they eat lots of rice, legumes, soy, quinoa, seitan, and seitan is this fake meat made out of wheat, but it's very high in protein, and they can use those as meat substitute. If they don't like rice, or they don't like legumes or whatever, then they're restricting their intake of these amino acids, and there may be problems. Here's one, I'm listing one particular amino acid, condition when you have deficiency in proteins called kwashiorkor. And this kwashiorkor is the body becomes so severely compromised that you get this disease. And it's mainly in developed countries. But when the food supply is poor, when it's a drought, when it's a war, the weather is terrible, you just don't get enough food or a range of food, then people start developing it. But as soon as you start eating the right foods, it more or less reverses. So the lack of dietary protein results in shortage of particular amino acids. So this is a little boy in Africa. It's very common. So I'll read this out. These include weight loss, decrease in muscle mass, changes in hair, skin, lots of diarrhea, extreme fatigue, difficulty recovering from infection. That means your immune system is buggered. Internally, the liver gets enlarged, and that's what you see here. That's a kid's liver. And you get, or you can get edema, where you get this massive swelling and retention of fluid right through the body. And if he doesn't get some decent proteins, he won't live long. I don't know how old this photo is. And a blood test could reveal other changes, such as the drop in blood cell numbers and the decrease in blood protein levels. Now, all sorts of problems occur if you don't have all the required 20 amino acids. Now, I thought I'd give you a little bit of comparative energy of our foods and the amount of energy that's released into our bodies. So with carbohydrates, for every gram, we can have 16 kilojoules. Proteins, about the same. Fats, on the other hand, are about 2.5 times. Alcohol, 29 kilojoules. 29 kilojoules. And they are empty calories. Now, what's a calorie? Or kilojoules? To give you an idea, I had to do some research. I found this. It takes 4.2 kilojoules to raise the temperature of 1 liter of water by 1 degree Celsius. So you can have 1 gram, small amount, 1 gram of carbs will raise water by 4 degrees. Fats, 9, 10 degrees. So it's a lot of energy. And alcohol, you get all this energy and it's useless, becomes fat. And one burning match releases about 1.1 kilojoules. So this is what research does. Amazing what you can find. Let's look at vitamins. Vitamins are essential for the workings of our body, like everything else. And they're involved in lots of our metabolic areas. And vitamins are also known as coenzymes. They're not enzymes. They work with the enzymes to make sure that everything's done. So the enzymes can't work without, so many enzymes can't work without the vitamin being there. So if you're short of vitamins, many of the enzymes will not work. So we have two sorts of vitamins. Some are, so the water solubles, they're not stored because they become very, very easily in our general diet. So the vitamin B group and vitamin C, they're water soluble. The other ones are fat soluble and they are stored in the body. So A, D, and the different forms of vitamin D, E, and K. And K, by the way, is essential for clotting of the blood. I don't know if you know, when a baby is born, first thing they do, one of the first things, they give it an injection of vitamin K to make sure that it has capacity to clot blood. Now, vitamins, we have supplements, and most people who are healthy, who eat a well-balanced diet, we don't need supplements. But some people do, and some people say, oh, I'll take vitamin C for my cold. There's absolutely no evidence, none, that it has any effect on the virus or even the symptoms of the virus. It really seems to have a placebo effect, so a psychological effect. And so I've just added the last bit. So by taking it for a cold, you actually end up with expensive urine. Vitamin C is water soluble and just goes right through. Now, there are people who require supplements, and these are times when there's a degree of malabsorption, a poor absorption of nutrients into the body, and this results in malnutrition. So you've got a problem, and sometimes you need to take them. For example, there's a condition called pernicious anemia. Now, anemia means the AEM tells you it's something to do with the blood, and the anemia is a condition where you have not enough blood, anemia, not enough blood. And the pernicious means it's done within the body. So there's a there's a molecule, it's called a carrier molecule. Mike, yes.
Sorry, I had the microphone open accidentally.
Oh, okay. You've got your hand up there, so.
Yeah, well, I had an earlier question, but I think I worked it out. When you said empty calories for alcohol, you mean it has no nutritional value?
Yes.
Is that what you mean?
Exactly.
Exactly. Thank you.
It's useless. You might enjoy
But
drinking, but
as you said, it's full of glycogen. That's what it is, glycogen.
No. There's no glycogen there. The body will take the alcohol and produce sugar out of it. And alcoholics get fatty tissues growing in different parts.
So alcohol is sugar without any nutritional value.
Alcohol is CH3OH. So you can make sugar out of that, yeah. The body can. But you don't want that sort of sugar.
It's not glucose,
It's what?
not glucose.
No, far from it. No.
Glucose
Make
comes
glucose. It can make glucose out of it, but that's far too much. If you have a sip, you have 100 mil, 200 mil of red wine, whatever. The alcohol, a lot of it will evaporate. The alcohol will get into your blood. The blood goes through the lungs, and you actually exhale a lot of the alcohol. You know, you can breath out, you can smell the breath of someone who's had some alcohol, you can smell it. But within the alcohol in the blood, it also enters some cells, and some cells, those cells can modify the alcohol and produce a sugar.
Thank you.
But they say that the red wine is more better than the white wine in some way. Is there any truth in that?
Alcohol is alcohol.
Okay.
It depends how much sugar. So a sweet wine or a liqueur has a huge amount of sugar in it.
Mm-hmm.
But if you just talk about the alcohol part, it's alcohol, it's ethanol.
Yeah.
Methanol is toxic. Ethanol
Mm-hmm.
is I think it's CH2OH. I can't remember exactly. Anyway, well, I can't remember. Oh yes, yes.
Yeah.
Now, pernicious anemia is anemia where where the body is not producing enough red blood cells. Excuse me. The stomach produces a molecule called a carrier molecule. It's called an intrinsic factor, and it carries the vitamin B12 when we eat it, and it also carries folate when we eat it. And this intrinsic factor produced in the stomach, right? And that's all what I just said. Now, what happens is when, so the vitamin B12 and the folate, they then get to the intestines linked to this molecule, this carrier molecule, the intrinsic factor, and it's absorbed in the body and everything's good. On the other hand, if the stomach, for some reason, stops producing this intrinsic factor, you get pernicious anemia because the vitamin B12 is required in the bone marrow to produce the red blood cells. The red blood cells, which are used to move oxygen around. So if you just don't have enough oxygen around, and you become anemic. And this pernicious anemia can damage the heart and the brain and other organs in the body. It also has other problems. It causes nerve damage, which causes neurological issues, especially memory loss. It also has digestive tract issues. And so what they do, it's a very simple treatment. You take tablets, vitamin B12 tablets, and I don't know what's going on with my throat. Vitamin B12.
Ruben, I've got a question when you get your voice back. With the pernicious anemia, if you take vitamin B12 or
Yes.
injection, I understand, but if you take it orally, it goes through the stomach, and
Yes.
if it's not enough intrinsic factor, it won't let it to absorb it.
That's right.
So it's only injections probably can do some,
Well, I don't know how the injection part works because the B12 in the tablets would link with the What's going to say?
Intrinsic factor. No?
Yes, the vitamin B12 tablets pick up the. I'll go back. Oh, sorry. I just got confused. All right. So it's the intrinsic factor is not there. By taking vitamin B12, it goes straight into the bloodstream. By injection, and if you take it by tablet, it goes in anyway. Through they must have a carrier in the tablet, part of the drug, the tablet.
Okay.
So it's the intrinsic factor is not there anymore, or not much of it. It's not, so the person has to take something else, B12, in another way. Normally B12 comes out of the food. It's picked up by the intrinsic factor, it's absorbed in the small intestine and goes to the bones, where it helps make the red blood cells. If the intrinsic factor is not there, the B12 will not be absorbed through the small intestine. So by giving it injections, the B12 is in the blood already, and then it ends up in the bones. And if you take a tablet, then there would have to be something attached to the B12, which allows it to move through the small intestine into the blood. And I don't know what the something is.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
It does. It does. Of course, it does. But yeah, injections actually probably better.
That's probably the better one. Yeah.
Okay.
It's like people who are short of iron get iron injections.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so it's called pernicious anemia is called an autoimmune condition. And vitamin deficiencies, there are lots of vitamins. If night blindness, if there's a shortage of vitamin A, I don't know if you know the story of during World War II, when the British sent bombers across the Channel to bomb parts of Germany. Some of the bombers got their bombs, the load, exactly where they had to take them, and others just couldn't find the target, they couldn't see them, and they had to return back to England, but they couldn't land with the bomb, so they just dropped them off into the English Channel in the sea. And during the war, they couldn't understand what this was going on, and they discovered that the people that they looked into the habits of the pilots and the navigators and the bombardiers. Now, in those days, everybody smoked, a lot of people smoked. Those who did not smoke had no trouble. I'm talking about cigarette smoke. Those who did not smoke had no trouble finding their target. Those who did smoke had night blindness, affected their vitamin A. And so they couldn't see where to drop the bombs. So once this was discovered, and it was forbidden to air crew to smoke, they got the bombs every time. It's reversible. So yes, vitamin A is important for us to see at night. And you say, I don't see anything at night. Well, if you get up at night and go to the toilet, as most people our age would do, you probably shade everything in grey, but you will also see lots of dots, lots of dots if you concentrate on it. And those dots are the spots where you can't see, and we have two different sorts of cells in the eye, those that see color and so that see light. The ones with the light they see the grey, they only see black and white anyway. Where the ones with the color are, in the back of the eye, they see nothing. And that's where you see the dots. The spots here. Anyway, that's by the by. So vitamin C, lack of vitamin C, scurvy, the teeth fall out, sores never heal, and the seagoing people eventually found that they had to have lots of vitamin C. They did it as pickled cabbage because it was easy to make and easy to carry in barrels. So the guys, the sailors, had to have, and Captain Cook apparently was absolutely 100% enforcing that his crew had to have this cabbage. I don't know whether it was every day or I don't know how often, but they didn't have any problems with scurvy. Vitamin D is rickets. The vitamin, what rickets does, it does not allow the bones to solidify. They're almost gel-like, but hard gel. They're fairly soft. And as a child who is lacking vitamin D, which you can get from the sun, but you can also take it, as the weight of the child increases, the bone, the big bone, starts to bow. Like that. So this is the normal bone, it's nice and straight. With rickets, the weight on it bows the femur, the big bone, and it causes issues there and they break. And I still remember walking down the street, say behind an old lady, and I could see her legs were like that. And I'm sure if you think back, you may have seen, especially girls, old ladies who were girls, who at the time when they were girls, they weren't allowed to be in the sun. They wore neck to ankle outfits, even for swimming in. So they got most of the vitamin D from the sun. The boys didn't have any problems. Now, if you have too much vitamin, and we have what are called water insoluble vitamins. I remember them as ADEK, ADEK, and they're stored in the liver and the fat. But if you have too much of it, it can lead to a toxicity, a problem. And you get what's called a hypervitaminosis. And each vitamin causes different problems. So if it's hypervitaminosis A, it leads to death. As the North Pole explorers found, they were hungry, they ran out of food, they saw bears, they killed them, they ate them, and those who ate the livers died, because the liver is where the vitamin A is stored, and polar bears had far too much vitamin A for humans to consume. Hypervitaminosis of D, you have abnormally high blood concentrations of calcium, and then other parts get overcalcified, like bones, the calcium in the soft tissue, the heart, the kidneys, so everything becomes not as flexible. And also, of course, because if the arteries are calcified to some degree, they don't expand every time the blood goes through from the heart, and you get this hypertension, high blood pressure. Vitamin E, hypervitaminosis, the E acts as an anticoagulant. So you've got too much vitamin E, you can easily bleed. The vitamin K in newborns leads to jaundice and anemia due to the rupture of the red blood cells. But that's very unusual. As I said before, they usually give vitamin K to newborns to make sure that their blood can clot. So that. Okay, now these are all the nice, healthy, the breads, the proteins, the fruits, and minerals. Just quickly now, dietary minerals. These are the things that we take in the food generally, and they can either be bulk or small amounts. But you have to have the right amount for whichever one it is, whichever mineral it is, to sustain good health. So here's a list. I'm not going to read the list. It's all there. You've got it. All these things, all these minerals, these elements are essential for our health. We have another list, and they're secondary. They're not essential, but they're very useful to have. And you notice arsenic is there too. A tiny bit in various reactions around the body. And different soils around the place have different minerals. So if you're growing things in soils, you have to make sure that you've got the right minerals. In some parts of Australia, in Western Australia, the soil a fair way away from the sea has got virtually no iodide in the soil. And cattle, the grass will grow, but cattle eating that grass lack the iodide. So what they've done, they've put these licks, they're called licks, they're sticks, and around the sticks, they made this, I don't know.
They're salt licks.
Huh?
Salt licks, they call them.
Say it again?
SALTLICKS.
Oh, that's right. Yes. And so they had a lot of iodide in there, and they're like a salt lick, which the cattle went and licked because they needed it, and they were healthy. There's no problem. That's just an example of where it's needed. And most of us living near the sea get enough iodide in our diet, because the fruit and vegetable that we eat, if they're near the sea, will have the iodide in it. Otherwise, people are encouraged to use iodized salt in their cooking.
I believe that also the white rice absorbs arsenic from the soil. So, that's why you have to rinse it really well before cooking.
Yes, arsenic.
That's what I heard on some time ago. It's hard to.
Ruben, may I ask something? It's in regards to the iodine. We live here. Well, all of us live here near the sea, and they still put additional iodine into the bread. That's not right. Not everybody can have bread or can have iodine. So
yeah, but I don't think there'd be very much of it. But our thyroid glands require, when they're producing thyroxine, to have the iodine. And if you get enough iodide, you get goiter. And
that's right. But that's true. That's true. But what about those people who have excess of the overreactive thyroid?
Aha, good question. I have no idea.
Yeah, that's what I've been questioning, all the time. Nobody can give me an answer.
Oh, Google it.
Well, it just happened that the one size fits all. That's how it goes in the population.
I really don't know.
Population of
people. The big problems are, but with lack of or deficiencies. Calcium is a big problem. If you don't have enough calcium, fatigue, sore muscles, osteoporosis, that's when the bones become porous and easily break. Iron leads to anemia, lack of magnesium. Now, nystagmus, I don't know if you know what they are, but it's when the eyes are moving backwards and forwards. Convulsions and so on. Cramps is a problem because muscles need magnesium to contract. Potassium is hypocaloric. Now, this is an interesting word here. The hypo means low. The cal is the Greek for potassium. The chemical symbol for potassium is K, and emia is something to do with the blood. Okay, so lack of potassium, muscle, heart, kidneys. Potassium is essential. Zinc is a problem too. You get hair loss, lack of, and all these aspects. And I don't want to forget water. Makes up a huge amount of our bodies. And so our intracellular fluid, that means the fluid inside all our cells, is about 2/3 of our body weight. The extracellular fluid, that means the fluid around the cells, is about 1/3 of our body weight. Now, the interstitial fluid, and that means in tissue, like the liver, the kidney, the heart, where this fluid between the cells is about 80% of the extracellular. And also the blood is part of extracellular fluid. Plasma, that's water in the blood and lymph, there. And here's a lovely thing, a nice breakdown. So 72% of our body is water. And it's maintained by various hormones, but it's essential we have enough water, otherwise we won't function particularly well. Dehydration, it can cause seizures, the brain swells, kidneys break down, shock, coma, and people even die. Amazing. You've got to have water somehow. If you have too much water, then you can also have brain damage and seizures and coma, and you can even die. Yeah. Here's the pyramid of nutrients. What you should have least of, what you should have most of. And I'm sure I'll put this into the notes and have a look. I won't go through them now. Diabetes is a problem where there's an excess of glucose in the blood. And it can lead to various parts of the body. I've got a friend who's type 1 diabetic and is injecting himself for a long, long time. And if he doesn't look up himself as well as he actually does, he would have degeneration of his fingers, other parts of his body, all sorts of problems can occur. But if diabetics look after themselves properly, this is the type 1, but the type 2, you can actually eliminate it. The type 1, the diet is very, very important, but he has to have insulin injections. He injects himself. The type 2 people, it's not an insulin. It is an insulin issue, but it's self-controlled. And a low carb diet seems to do it well. I'll skip that. Here's another one. So a variety of foods. I put in different pyramid just so different people might be attracted to one or the other, but basically the same stuff. Common conditions of the gastrointestinal tract get acid reflux. Now, the stomach is at a pH of 1. Hydrochloric at a acid at a pH of 1 is very, very strong. Sometimes you get a reflux, and too often you can actually burn your esophagus. It's not good, but you can take stuff for that. Appendicitis, celiac disease. I've got 2 celiacs in the family. This is where they can't eat my
It's
head.
gluten. It's gluten.
Gluten, thank you. If they have a little bit of gluten, the small intestine reacts and all their villi disappear. So they can't absorb food properly. Crohn's disease, gallstones, irritable bowel syndrome is terrible. Ulcerative colitis, where you get ulcers in the colon. FODMAP, I've got my 2 daughters are FODMAP, and that, by the way, stands for fermentable. So things that will ferment inside. Oligosaccharides, a type number of large sugars. Disaccharides like sucrose, so I can't have that. Monosaccharide, the single sugars. And polyols are like the sugars, but they're like alcohol when the OL is there. Aware of the time. Now, this is, I think this is the last thing yet. I found this article. It's a TED talk. It goes for 13.5 minutes. It's fantastic. It's absolutely fantastic. All the things we talked about, they can now make, and I won't tell you too much about it. If you've got a quarter of an hour, please watch it. It's research in Israel. I think I can't remember the date, but about 8 years ago. I can't remember. Anyway, I just put in there for your interest. If you want to see it, I watched it again and I just got blown away by what is in that. So, okay, I'll stop that. So, guys, I am now complete. Are there any other questions I can answer?
Ruben, I am very interested in the, unfortunately, the Holocaust surviving people who survived, like had no nutrients whatsoever. And those who survived seem to have very lengthy life, long life living. You know, there's been a lot of disputes about it. I'm just wondering why you haven't heard that. No.
Well, I suppose people are different. So the people who live to 100 and the people who die at 60.
Well, apparently they didn't eat all the processed foods, as you know.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Things like that.
Did anything?
They were lucky to eat.
Yes. So that in one way was positive somehow.
Yes, somehow.
You know,
but I wouldn't wish that on anybody.
No. It's just curious to see that a lot of people that survived are quite well and live to long lives.
Well, I've got an aunt, aged care, Jewish care, and she's nearly 94.
Right.
Got dementia, but the rest of her is good.
All right. Well, I'm looking after a lady who's 105 years old.
Oh, yeah.
And she is so smart and so exact. I've got to be very prepared for her.
Fantastic.
And she survived many Holocaust tragedies. Yeah, so just one of those things.
Yeah. All right, guys.
Thank you.
I look forward to seeing you in a fortnight.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
All the best.
Really enjoy.
Thanks very much. Good on you. Hi, Anna.
Thanks, Ruben.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
You have a lovely week. Well, 2 weeks.
And happy birthday.
Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah. A couple of weeks ago, but yeah.
Well, it's better later than never, isn't it? Happy birthday.
Yeah. Thank you. 75 doesn't feel old anymore.
No. Keep it up. Okay, thanks.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Later out. Yeah.
Later out. Yeah. Okay.
Mike, a bugle.
Ruben, thank you for the lecture. It was very clear and very informative. I'm quite new in chemistry.
Yeah.
If you don't mind, very briefly, you can explain to me, in your chemical diagrams, you refer to single bonds and double bonds. What's the difference of these double bonds to one bond?
Okay. Oh, Mike.
I'll look it up. I'll Google it.
I think next time I meet you, a band. It'd be much easier for me to draw it for you.
I saw the diagrams. It's
Yes.
got 2 lines, while
Yeah.
the others have 1 line.
That's right. It's all got to do with the number of electrons. So
It's electron bonds. is it?
electrons. So an electron from one molecule, one atom, and another atom together. All right. So you got hydrogen. Hydrogen has got 1 electron.
Yes.
Okay. Now the electron spins around it, and you got 2 hydrogens. Say they will then join together. They don't actually join together, but then they spin around the 2, and that makes 1 bond. So 2 electrons makes a bond. Now, it's much easier if I can draw it for you, but if you have, so you can have double bond, you saw double bond, but you can have triple bonds as well, which are very, very strong bonds, and they have 6 electrons there. But they're not just sitting there, they're going around all the time, but holding everything together.
So these bonds, it's how many electrons?
Each bond, each line is 2 electrons.
Right, that's what it's how many electrons join with the molecules.
Yeah.
Or it's
could I suggest
with the other components?
Yeah, with other atoms, yes.
Yes. It's I get the general idea.
Why don't you Google chemical bonds?
Oh yeah, that would be a good
Or chemical
idea.
bonding. That's even better.
Yes.
And that'll give you the idea.
Fine.
Well, I hope to see you here again, and good luck. Tomorrow you've got is it Thursday you've got the operation?
Day after tomorrow. And then they're going to keep me in for
2 days.
the following day.
Okay.
I've started doing this because, I miss the music.
Yes.
And I don't have the tuba, and the trombone is too big. And actually, I told you that we are renovating our flat because we had a water leak. So we moved to another apartment. So quite a lot of the things that I need are not here.
Okay.
Pick this up, and I'm trying to learn the basic notes, but it's